In this presentation I'll be looking at two poems, Kamikaze by Beatrice, Garland and Checking Out My History by John Agard, looking at them independently and then a little comparison of the two at the end. In terms of themes for Kamikaze, and most of these themes actually apply to both poems, I'm going to be looking at national versus personal identity and the conflict between those two ideas. The effect of conflict on identity, that's particularly pertinent to Kamikaze. Heritage and history and the importance of those in shaping identity, and that's really relevant to both poems. And then familial conflict, which is really only relevant to Kamikaze. Kamikaze as a title then translates as divine wind or spirit wind. Kamikaze pilots, for anyone who doesn't know, would fly specially adapted aircraft loaded with explosives into Allied Navy vessels during World War II, with the aim being to inflict as much damage as possible. This is all intertwined with notions of dying for personal and national honour, the notions which are deeply entrenched in Japanese culture through the identity of the samurai and the Bushido Code. Narrative perspective is really, really important in this poem. We start off with an unknown third-person narrator for the first 5 stanzas, and then we shift in the final 2 stanzas to the pilot's daughter. We get the perspective of the pilot's wife and the mother of the daughter, but through the eyes of the daughter, and we also get some of the pilot's thoughts, but notably through the eyes of the unknown narrator. It's really, really important because what this means is the pilot significantly doesn't get his own say in this poem. He doesn't have an opportunity to tell his own story. He therefore doesn't have the power to shape his own identity. His identity is being shaped by the unknown third-person narrator and by the narration of his daughter, and also through the thoughts of his wife, which are related to us by his daughter. But it's significant that he doesn't get a say. Let's have a look at the first stanza then. Her father embarked at sunrise with a flask of water, a samurai sword in the cockpit, a shaven head full of powerful incantations, and enough fuel for a one-way journey into history. The thoughts that I'm going to go through in this poem are my own reflections on the poem, and also the thoughts of the wonderful Year 11 students that I'm teaching this year, who've taught me an awful lot about the poem as we've learned it together. It's not the be-all and end-all, and it's not a definitive version of what this poem's about, so if you've learned it in a different way and some different meanings to this poem, that's absolutely fine. Please just use these to reinforce or to build on your own ideas. So I'm going to have a look at the symbolism in this opening stanza. First of all, the idea that the pilot embarked at sunrise. Sunrise, of course, having connotations of new beginnings. But also we have the idea of the land of the rising sun here, which is synonymous with Japan. And so straight away, the father's journey seems to be intertwined with the desires and connotations and identity of his nation. And we see that conflict between personal and national identity all the way through this poem. We see it next in the juxtaposition of the flask of water and the samurai sword. The flask of water, of course, carrying connotations of life and new beginnings. But that is combined with the samurai sword, which is a symbol of Japan and also a symbol of conflict. But it's also a symbol of protection. And we get this conflict between the desire to protect the honour of his country and the desire to protect his family. And he can't quite bring those two ideas together at any point. Then we learn that the pilot has a shaven head. This suggests to me that he is exposed to judgment of some kind, but also there are connotations of a prisoner here, and perhaps this highlights the idea that he is imprisoned by national expectation. and his head is full of powerful incantations. Incantations are spells, and this leads into the idea of indoctrination. His identity has been shaped, has been moulded, has been manipulated by national expectations of honour and glory. An incantation also is slightly outdated, something antiquated about the idea of an incantation. So perhaps this is a criticism by the poet of those ideas of national glory. Perhaps Garland is suggesting that they are outdated and antiquated and don't belong in modern society. And we finish with this stanza with a one-way journey into history. There is a suggestion here of the inevitability of death, either in real terms or the death of as a father or a husband. He's going to lose his identity in some way, either as a son of the nation or as a father and husband. But there's inevitability about it, and he seems to be not in control of that process. Moving on to stanza 2, and this is where the narrative perspective becomes particularly important, because it starts with, "But halfway there she thought," recounting it later to her children. So we get this idea that the narrator is telling the story on behalf of the pilot's daughter. And in doing so, we're very much distanced from the truth, and we're also distanced from the pilot. And this reveals to us how far away the pilot is from controlling his own identity and our own perception of him. But this also becomes an unreliable narration. We get it through another person, on behalf of another person. So we get several versions of history retold, and as history is retold, it becomes more and more unreliable, because history is always reliant on the perspective and the ideology of the person retelling it. And that sort of doubt and uncertainty about the truth of this narrative is captured in that caesura, the medial caesura, halfway through line 1, "But halfway there she thought." And that pause is loaded with doubt. And then the daughter thinks he must have looked far down. It's not definite, and it seems that she is trying to justify in some way what her father has done. And this is perhaps a denial of the fear that he experienced, because that would be shameful. But it's also part of this narrative of the pilot having his identity shaped for him. Now, what supposedly the pilot saw when he looked down were the little fishing boats strung out like bunting on a green-blue translucent sea. And this is where the pilot's doubt begins. He looks down at the land below him, and he looks down at the natural world and the sea, and he sees little fishing boats, a reminder of his past. It seems to me that he's looking to his past to try and form some sense of who he is, to try and re-establish his identity. And he sees the little fishing boats like bunting, and that simile seems to confirm that there is a celebration in nature and his past. There's something to be cherished there. But significantly, also what he sees is a green-blue translucent sea. Now, translucent is something cloudy. It's almost see-through, but you can't see through it entirely. It's clouded. So there seems to be a lack of clarity in his identity. He looks down to try and find some clarity, but he doesn't find it. And that's significant, as we see as we go through this whole poem. That conflict of his identity pervades many of the ideas and images of the poem as a whole. On to stanza 3 then, and beneath them, arcing in swathes like a huge flag, waved first one way, then the other in a figure of 8, the dark shoals of fishes, flashing silver as their bellies swivel towards the sun. And here we see the way in which the pilot's identity is controlled by the nation, because he looks down and he sees these images of his past, the little fishing boats. And then he sees the fishes, and they appear like a huge flag. Now, of course, the flag carries connotations of patriotism and national identity. And it seems significant that he sees this image in the natural world, in the shoal of fishes. The line between what is natural, that is human, and what is nationalistic propaganda in the form of the flag has been blurred. There's a conflict here between his identity as a human being, as a father, as a son, as a grandson, as a husband, and a conflict between that and between what his nation wants him to be. He cannot escape the pressures of national identity as he's looking for himself in the images below. And that idea is confirmed in the juxtaposition of light and dark that we see in this stanza and that we see throughout the poem. We've got the dark shoals of fishes juxtaposed between the flashing silver and the sun. And that conflict of dark and light is perhaps the conflict between the darkness of societal expectation and the innate goodness of the pilot as a man. We're then told that the shoals of fishes swiveled their bellies towards the sun. It seems that even nature is drawn towards ideas of national glory. So national expectation is so powerful that it seems, in the pilot's eyes at least, to influence even nature. And then we get this idea that the flag is waved in a figure of eight. Figure of eight, of course, being a symbol for infinity. So the expectation of his nation in shaping his identity is inescapable and perpetual. On to stanza 4, and the pilot continues to reminisce about his childhood. He's looking to his past to try and re-establish some sense of who he is, and remembered how he and his brothers waiting on the shore built cairns of pearl grey pebbles to see who's withstood longest the turbulent inrush of breakers, bringing their father's boat safe. First of all, we get the symbolism of waves, and I've spoken to my students about this, that often in poetry waves are symbolic of time. We get this idea of the tides being symbolic of time. They come and go and they are perpetual. And this seems to be a pertinent image at this stage because we get this idea of time's ability to destroy the past, to destroy the innocence of childhood as we move into the darkness and troubles of adulthood. And that seems to be the problem that the pilot is experiencing here. He's looking back and clinging to the innocence of childhood, but there's a recognition that time is wearing that away. We also get a contrast of sounds. It's a brilliant poem in terms of its sonic methods, this Kamikaze. We get the contrast of plosives and assonance here. Pearl grey pebbles, where we get the plosives, built cairns of pearl grey pebbles loaded with plosives. But then we get the softness of the assonance in who's withstood longest the turbulent inrush. So we get that contrast of harshness and softness seems to contain the conflict of the destructive expectations of his nation and the softness of his familial duty. And that seems to sum up the conflict of identity that this man is experiencing. Duty to his country, but also love towards his family. And the contrasts in this poem, in this stanza and in the poem as a whole, as I've already said, are perhaps about the conflicts of the innocent safety of childhood, which eventually becomes the violent difficulty of adulthood. We see again that in the contrast of pearl grey, the dullness of grey contrasted with the iridescent beauty of the pearl, reflects the conflict in this man's identity. And the stanza finishes with boat safe. He clearly finds comfort in the safety of these childhood memories and the innocence that they moving on to stanza 5, which starts with the first interjection by his daughter. We get that at the start of this stanza. Yes, grandfather's boat. The daughter's voice is important here because it seems the desire to remember the man he was, not the man he has become. She's ashamed of the man he has become, and she wants to remember the past, like her father does. Again, we get the contrast of sounds in here between plosives and fricatives and sibilants and assonants. We get harshness contrasted with softness. We also get the contrast of light and dark. We've got shore salt sodden awash with cloud marked mackerel. Lots of sibilants and fricatives there, but then we get the plosives of black crabs, and we get the light of the silver of whitebait contrasted with the dark prints, the tuna. So we get those conflicts all the way through this poem, which seem to symbolise the conflict within this man's identity. We get our first end stop of the poem, our first full stop after dangerous. This is perhaps a moment of reflection by the daughter or the narrator. And it seems perhaps that the tuna maybe represents her father here. There is a recognition of her fear of him, but also her admiration for him. He is something to be admired. The sibilance in this stanza comes across almost as apologetic or a silencing, which might reflect the daughter's and society's silencing of the pilot. He is very much having his identity shaped by others. When we get on to stanzas 6 and 7, this is where the narrative perspective changes for good, and we get the pilot's daughter's voice now. And though he came back, my mother never spoke again in his presence, nor did she meet his eyes, and the neighbours too, they treated him as though he no longer existed. Only we children still chattered and laughed, till gradually we too learned to be silent, to live as though he had never returned, that this was no longer the father we loved. And then we go back to the original narrator at the end, and sometimes she said he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. Now, the tone of voice here of the daughter, the enjambment throughout this poem, and particularly in this section, gives the daughter's words almost a breathless tone of regret. She does seem to be regretful here about what has happened to her father. And that's perhaps why we go back to the other narrator at the end, and sometimes she said he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. Perhaps because the daughter actually can't bring herself to say that. So there is a degree of pity for her father at the end here, I think. The pronouns here are significant. There's a separation in stanza 6 between they and we. They, of course, is the adults, and we is the children. Children are not predisposed to judgment. That only comes with the cynicism of adulthood. And they hints at the idea that the daughter's views are not aligned with the government, certainly not as children. They have had to learn those views. Judgment and national loyalty seems to be imprinted upon the minds of the innocent children as much as it was imprinted on the mind of the pilot. So this idea of national expectation is inescapable, whoever you are. Just a quick discussion about the form, and particularly the lack of end stops and the prominent use of enjambment in this poem. The enjambment perhaps reflects the relentless inescapability of national expectation and the lack of control the pilot has to shape his own identity. There are one or two moments of significant caesura. These are at times moments of reflection by the daughter as she ponders her thoughts on her own father, and also moments of reinforcement where it slows down to reinforce a message, to confirm the power of the narrators to shape the pilot's identity in this poem. Now I'm going to move on to John Agard's poem, Checking Out My History, and I'm going to start with this quotation from Barack Obama. My identity might begin with the fact of my race, but it couldn't end there. At least that's what I would choose to believe. This is a poem about what is it that defines us, who defines us, and it's an ongoing process of shaping identity. And I think Barack Obama captures that very nicely. This video is worth watching. It's a BBC bite-sized video, and John Agard talks about his motivations for writing this poem. He also reads the poem beautifully and in the vernacular in which it is supposed to be read, which is really important to your understanding of the poem. I very much recommend watching that. It's 4 or 5 minutes long. John Agard, it's important for us to understand who he was because it's pivotal to our understanding of this poem. Born in Guyana in 1949, now living in Britain, educated in the Caribbean but under a British curriculum as part of Commonwealth rule, and taught that his history was a white European history in line with the British curriculum. And this is very much a poem about the conflict between what he was taught about himself and what he comes to learn about himself through his own endeavours. We start the poem with these 3 lines: dem tell me what dem want to tell me. It's a first person narration, which is a significant difference to Kamikaze. The narrator here, which we can only assume is Agar's own voice, is in control of his own destiny and in control of his own identity and the way the reader perceives him. That's really, really important. The pilot in Kamikaze was completely devoid of that same control. We get some anaphora in the opening 2 lines. The repetition of dem and dem at the start of lines 1 and 2 gives the poem an accusatory tone, I think. We get an anger in the speaker's voice straight away. But also the repetition and the anaphora, and then the repetition of the imperative verb tell, so dem tell and dem tell, creates this idea of repression. It really captures the idea that Agar felt repressed by his educators and by his education. It's important, and you'll notice this if you listen to Agar read it, the Creole dialect in which this poem is written and read is perhaps a reaction against the British education he received and a way through which Agar goes about establishing his own identity, which is independent from his education. The next stage of the poem talks about the way they bandaged up his eye with his own history and blinded him to his own identity. First of all, we'll deal with bandage in the semantic field of injury, but also in the semantic field of healing. So there's this idea, first of all, that the way in which his history was taught to him has damaged his identity and his understanding of who he is, but also it is giving him a route, a way in which he can start to heal those wounds through the process of self-discovery. And then he says, blind me to my own identity. Well, that word blind comes with connotations of restriction, repression, a lack of guidance and direction. And his education, he makes the point here that his education very much lacked direction and guidance in giving him the route, or not giving him the route to discover who he was. He's had to do that for himself. And I think in this second stanza, Agar really does drive home this accusatory tone and encourages the reader to react against Dem or his educators here. What Agar does then, he talks about the things that they told him, which about nursery rhymes and white European history, which he belittles through the tone of the poem. And then he talks about the things that they didn't tell him. And we get 3 different sections, and he refers to 3 different 4 black historical figures that his education didn't tell him about. And he starts with Tucson Lowbacher. Tucson, a slave with vision, licked back Napoleon battalion and first Black Republic born, Toussaint de Torn, to the French Toussaint de Beacon of the Haitian Revolution. First of all, the grammatical structures break down even more here, almost as if he is rebelling even further against the education that he received. But I'm going to look at each of these figures in turn and why perhaps Agar chose them. Toussaint Louverture, a leader of the Haitian Revolution. He was born a slave in Haiti, which was then a French colony of Saint Domingue. And he adopted the surname Louverture, as in French it means the one who opened the way. So this is a man very much associated with emancipation from repression, from slavery. He seems to be the perfect symbol for Agar to include in this poem, because this is a poem about breaking free from repression and opening the way to discovering yourself. The next Black historical figure that he wasn't told about in his education is Nani of the Maroons, or Nani de Maroon as Agar refers to her. She was born in what is known today as Ghana, and she arrived again like Toussaint. She was a slave, but she led a group of formerly enslaved Africans called the Wynwood Maroons, and she is credited with freeing over 1,000 slaves over a period of 30 years. So again, a figure of emancipation and freedom from repression, very much what Agar is doing through the writing of this poem. We'll look at the symbols and the metaphors that are used to refer to these characters a bit later on. The third character that Agar refers to from Black history is Mary Seacole from Jamaica. She travelled far to the Crimean War. She volunteered to go, and even when the British said no, she still braved the Russian snow, a healing star among the wounded, a yellow sunrise to the dying. Mary Seacole was a nurse, and she wanted to go and work in the Crimean War but was prevented from doing so. So she used her own money to go to the Crimea anyway. She set up a hotel in the heart of the battlefield and gave hot food to the soldiers, and she received the Crimean Medal for her work. And Agar's point is that we celebrate Florence Nightingale in our British curriculum, but we do not, or we didn't previously, we do now to a greater extent, we did not previously celebrate Mary Seacole. But this is a woman who is associated with healing, and the writing of this poem, as well as being an emancipation from the repressive nature of slavery, is also about healing the wounds and the damage done to him by his education. And so Mary Seacole seems to be the perfect symbol for Agar to refer to. If we look at the way in which Agar writes about these Black historical figures, we can see the importance they have to him in shaping who he is. Toussaint is referred to as the beacon to the Haitian Revolution. Mary Seacole as the healing star and the yellow sunrise. Nani of the Maroons as Freedom River. They all have something in common. They are all associated with a journey of some kind, guidance and navigation. This is very much a journey of self-discovery for Agar, going into the past, looking at his true history to find out who he is, refusing to be repressed by national expectation or the expectation of his educators, and finding his identity for himself. He's being guided by these Black historical figures and what they represent. The beacon also represents safety. He feels comforted by these historical figures. They give him a sense of direction. The yellow sunrise is about new beginnings and discovery, and the river is about, the Freedom River is about emancipation. So they're perfect metaphors to sum up what these black historical figures give to Agar in his journey of discovering his own identity. The form is important to look at. It's a completely irregular form, which seems to be a reaction against the regularity of his education. Similarly, there is no punctuation at all in this poem, not a single punctuation mark, which seems to be a rebellion against his repressive education and the expectation of his educators. It's significant that there's no full stop even at the end of this poem, because this process of self-discovery is an ongoing one. It is not complete. This is very different from Kamikaze, where there is a sense that the pilot's identity is completely shaped for him by the end of the poem. But for Agar, the process is ongoing and is not complete. In terms of structure, the verbs are quite interesting. At the opening of the poem, we get those imperative verbs, tell, bandage, and blind. And this is about repression, isn't it? It's about the way in which people have tried to enforce an identity upon Agar. But the verbs at the end reveal to us that they have been unsuccessful, because checking, he is in control of that process, and carving, this is about an ongoing process of self-discovery. So the progressive nature of the verbs signify the progressive nature of Agar's own self-discovery. And that final verb is really, really important and powerful. Carving comes with connotations of effort. This process is not a straightforward one, but it is an individual one. It's an act of individual expression. He's taking ownership of the process, which the pilot in Kamikaze was unable to do. He's stripped of that right. And there's something underneath to be discovered when you are carving. And that's what Agar's doing here. He's taking what he was given and revealing something much more beautiful underneath. So it's a clear comparison between these two poems in terms of the power of nations, and also about human identity and the conflict between national identity and individual identity. What I'm trying to do here is to pick out some comparisons, but always within comparisons, even within similarities, there will always be subtle differences. And if you want to strengthen your comparison, look for the subtle differences within your similarities. For example, in Kamikaze, we see the repressive nature of society in shaping individual identity. The evidence might be a shaven head and powerful incantations. There's lots of evidence in that poem for the same idea. Similarly, in Checking Out Me History, we get the repressive nature of society in shaping individual identity. We've got the anaphora and the repetition of the imperative verbs at the start. But the subtle difference here is that in Kamikaze, that shaping has a finality to it. It is ubiquitous. It is everywhere. In Checking Out Me History, that repression can be overcome by the individual. So that is the subtle difference within the similarity. Again, in Kamikaze, true identity, individual identity, is hidden or conflicted by national expectation. We've got some evidence there to support it. And in Checking Out My History, again, individual identity hidden or harmed by ideas of national identity. However, in Checking Out My History, individual identity is eventually established, whereas that right is not given to the pilot in Kamikaze. How might that be written up? Well, I'll read this out and then I'll explain what I'm trying to do. Remember, Assessment Objective 1, AO1, is about your ideas which relate to the poems and the question, and your use of evidence and quotations. AO2 is about your analysis of methods, and AO3 is about context. And I'll describe which of those assessment objectives I think I'm hitting as I go through. In Kamikaze, the poet presents the idea that repression of societal ideas leads to the shaping of individual identity. There's my idea that relates to the poem and a question about power and identity. The fact that Kamikaze pilot in the opening stanza has a shaven head, there's my evidence, AO1, perhaps alludes to the fact that he has been stripped of his individuality. With the shaven head creating images of prisoners, we are introduced to the notion that the power of societal expectation has the ability to imprison people and turn them into generic identities. What I try to do, and I'd encourage you to do the same, is once you've used your quotations, go into your quotation and pull out the meaning. So here I'm looking at the connotation of that image and how that relates to the meaning of the poem. I also like to see in each paragraph 2 quotations at least, really, to support your ideas, because that shows a rounded knowledge of your text or your idea or your poem. This notion is reinforced by the fact that his head is full of powerful incantations, carrying the idea that the pilot has been brainwashed in some way, stripped of his ability to construct an identity on a personal level. I could look at that a little bit more closely, the connotations of incantations and the poet's message there. I haven't included the poet's message, which I could have done. Now you bring in your comparison. Similarly, so you're going to use a comparative connective at the start of paragraph 2. Similarly, in checking out me history, Agar confirms the way in which identity is shaped by societal expectation. It could be a difference, and you'd use a different connective if it was a difference. Bring in my evidence again. The anaphora of Dem Tell Me at the start of the poem reinforces the way in which identity was forced upon him by his white educators. But then go back into that quotation. The pronouns of dem and me creates a feeling of separation, which perhaps alludes to the idea that Agar felt personally detached from the identity which was forced upon him. Don't leave poem 1 behind. Try and maintain your comparisons as you go. So here I go back to Kamikaze. However, whereas in Kamikaze there is a finality to that shaping of identity, in checking out me history, Agar shows us that the repression of society can be overcome. The use of his own Creole dialect appears to be a reaction against societal expectation and a move towards the establishment of his own personal identity. So this is about ideas, lots of evidence, analyse that evidence in detail, and maintain your comparison as you go. I'm going to produce another video which is about how to write up the poetry comparison, but I hope that's been helpful in terms of ideas for both of these poems and ways in which you might compare them.